There was one last project for the year. For things were about to change. Someone would move in with me. We all fall in love. We say falling because it is not entirely our choice. Neither was it in my case. But if your lover wants to move in, you gotta prepare your place as best you can. Maybe some Catholic viewers gasped and now smile. Others might still be confused. Who is moving in? No stranger. He has been a daily visitor. But so far, I could adore Christ in the Eucharist only at Mass or right after. Recently, the local bishop gave me permission to reserve the Eucharist in the periods I was here, and so I needed a secure tabernacle for my chapel. The word tabernacle is a reference to the tent sanctuary built by Moses and the Israelites in the desert after the Exodus. It would later be the mold for the temple in Jerusalem that stands no longer. But the presence of God among his people, which the temple signified, has not ended. For Christ promised to be with us until the end of days. If you want to understand how Catholics and the other old apostolic churches understand this presence, I recommend the book Jesus and the Jewish Roots of the Eucharist by Brand Pitre. I recommend it even and especially if you're Catholic. It will doubtlessly lead your heart into joy and praise. This final reflection was the most difficult, and I penned many paragraphs that did not make the cut. Like all these reflections, they are just thoughts. Thoughts that I've tried to sort and put in some order, hoping they're helpful. But they're not exhaustive, and if you disagree or see a major flaw in my thinking, be sure to let me know, for I learn all the time. It is with understanding that I read comments now and again that are weary of the human element in religion or voice mistrust. Comments that embrace spirituality but not religion for that reason. Comments that can accept Jesus but not the Church, least of all the Catholic Church. I understand, even if for reasons, such as those presented in this series, I cannot agree. I have expressed in the last 2 episodes that religion is not an individualistic affair, but that it has a social element. This is necessarily so because we are social creatures. And yet this social dimension, as we have seen, which manifests in organization, liturgy, culture and institutions, not only comes with the promise of greater fulfillment, but with risks. Risks that we should all try to minimize. In this endeavor, I suggested that we can both examine the structure of these institutions and we can examine ourselves, our behavior. The big lines concerning structure were drawn in the last episode. We have seen advantages and disadvantages of the proposed organizational models, and maybe you disagree with my assessment both concerning their origin and the value. And even if you don't, you might have questions regarding other, more particular things that could be considered structural and possibly negative. People, for example, have suggested for my Catholic faith that celibacy is a systematic and structural cause of many ills. Ills such as abuse that would be mitigated with married clergy. Having read the report of the John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Royal Commission in Australia, that common wisdom is not supported. I had a whole section here in the reflection to look at this question in more detail because it is so frequently brought before me. But I ended up taking it out. You have to see it for yourself. Google the official numbers of abuse reported to police in your country for a given year and realize how horrendous the problem really is. And that it is in our families where most of these cases occur, but are obviously not widely reported. Then add the hidden figures that remain in the dark because of shame. After all, it concerns one's own family and relations. I don't say this to relativize what happens in religious institutions. I say it to ask those who believe that abolishing celibacy would severely curb this crime if they have thought things through. Or, worse, whether they are using those crimes to push for a particular agenda within the Church on the backs of victims and survivors. Much more relevant than celibacy to this problem in terms of structure is access to children and the power differential. These are the markers of abuse across the spectrum of professions that are most notorious in these crime statistics, including educators, youth leaders, sport coaches. It is here that the Church often fails children for a first time. The second time is when the fear of scandal leads to cover-ups and, in the worst case, to more victims because the criminal was reassigned elsewhere. It is true that in the 60s and 70s, when the numbers of abuse were highest according to statistics, experts in the field of psychology frequently counseled bishops that a therapy could cure the offender. But this does not absolve from much of what was done or not done. And it makes current failures all the more egregious. Failures that, according to the words of Christ, deserve a millstone around the neck. We are not talking about some backwater of the Church either. I'm infuriated by men in the Vatican, even, and maybe especially so, by the one wearing white. There is much wrong in my Church. There are honest people, people working for the good. There are steps that are taken, structures that need improvement and are improved. But there is also much cronyism and self-flattery because in high places you will not only find shepherds of souls, but peacocks who love the world. This is why in dealing with the current state of the Church we not only have to look at structures, though it needs to be done, but at ourselves and how we best respond to this quagmire. Lord Acton, an English Catholic politician, writer and historian, is famous for his words, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Maybe this particular statement needs some qualification, but in the very same letter he wrote something that seems true to me in a more straightforward way, even if slightly hyperbolic. He writes, "There is no worse heresy than that the office sanctifies the holder of it." Lord Acton rightly saw no reason that kings or popes should be judged with more lenience than the common man. If anything, they should be judged more harshly. In fact, I think they will be, in the end. For the Gospel of Luke relates the words of Christ, "To whomsoever much is given, of him shall much be required." This distinction between the person and the office is an important one, and one that religious people, I mean believers, often get wrong. They admire their pastors, preachers, charismatic speakers, and clergy. They venerate their leaders. Bishops and popes are defended not because they are good men, but because they hold that lofty office. Priests are adored and made out to be holy, not because they are, but because they are imagined to be. All kinds of virtues are projected on them because they have answered the call. All sorts of trust is placed at their feet because of what they should be. To be frank, I'm not comfortable with a number of comments I've received under either my videos or under videos about me on YouTube. For I'm a man, a fallible man, and a man that falls all the time. I'm not proud of it, and those who have read my travel diaries will glance at my shortcomings at every third page. I distinguish between my fallible self and the holy office that I hold as a priest. And I think everyone else should too. To get closer to my meaning, I would like to explore two concepts: power and authority. Under the term power, people understand different things. Some think of it as strength, others see it as a form of violence. Hannah Arendt, who fled the Nazis for the US in 1941, distinguished power from both and used the term as something positive, saying that power emerges from cooperation. So the word power can have many meanings, and I will not be able to explore or reconcile them all. I would like to keep it simple and start with its Latin root, potestas, which simply denotes an ability. And I will use the term power here in that sense, as an ability. More specifically, the ability to enforce one's will. Any community of people knows power in this general form. Your thoughts may go immediately towards dictatorships. Enforcing one's will sounds problematic to our ears. But that is not what I mean. As soon as someone pins a cleaning schedule onto the fridge in a shared apartment, we see power. The residents have worked out a plan, decided on it, and submitted their will as individuals to the will of the collective. They give it a binding force, that is, power. Why? So that the frozen pizza crumbs in the communal kitchen don't get dramatically out of hand. So the term power, in the sense I use it here, is neither good nor bad. In itself, it is neutral. But power can be good or bad. How? Either through its end, or through the means chosen for that end. Regarding the end, I hold that power is good if it is in service of the common good. The common good does not mean the good of many over the good of the few, but the true good of all. This is something that in itself would require a lengthy discussion, for which there is no room here. So maybe it is better to point to a case that is easier to see. Bad use of power. This is where power is not in the service of the common good, but directed to the arbitrary goals of someone or some group. An example of that would be the tyrant. A tyrant subordinates the common good to his own private good. While outright political tyrants may thankfully be somewhat rare, The corruption of power begins long before this full-fledged despotism. It usually begins where politics becomes clever, and hardly anyone has ever been as clever as Niccolò Machiavelli. In his work *The Prince*, published in 1532, he was not concerned with the question of good use of power, but what is useful to the ruler to maintain power. By no means does he advocate brute force in all cases. The art of creating the right appearance and observing a few fundamental commandments, so as not to antagonize the people, can be more useful to the ruler, Machiavelli believed, without of course excluding terror, if expedient. Not justice, but deception and intrigue may be the necessary political instruments, if it helps to maintain power. This shift was momentous. Machiavelli separated power from its end. In fact, in his understanding, power became the end. He detached the social order, and above all the ruler, from a binding objective good. Governing states was not about preserving justice and peace, but about understanding the opposing forces that existed among people. Power was acquired and held by those who could harness these forces, who knew how to play them off against each other, direct them, and thereby impose their will. Reading Machiavelli, some would say that his analysis of human nature is quite true. It is far more pessimistic than that of the ancient Greeks and the churchmen with their ideas of virtue. These Machiavelli dismissed precisely because they were not practical and, according to him, impossible. Instead of the difficult pursuit of the common good, he just gave up, declared it unattainable, and then counseled the rulers to cleverly take advantage of their fortunate position. His conception of power politics not only prepared the way for absolutism and the authoritarian state, but also changed the meaning of how power was understood. It was no longer qualified by the good, but independent from it. It was something taken and held, until challenged by a stronger competing will. For those who had no power, it had become something decidedly bad, something that was aimed not at their good, but at their exploitation for the benefit of the powerful. And I think this is why the term power in our day is no longer neutral, but has acquired a negative connotation. Let us now look at a different concept: authority. Authority never has its source in the person who wields it, writes Hannah Arendt. For unlike power, authority does not originate in a person's will, but is based on something outside the person exercising it. Depending on that external source, one can distinguish different kinds of authority. There is, for example, something that could be called natural authority. Parents have it with respect to their children. Secondly, authority can be acquired. In this sense, one speaks of a person as an authority in this or that field. Thirdly, authority can be conferred. A civil servant exercises authority on behalf of the state and the people in that state. Or, in the Church, it is bishops that have authority as successors of the apostles appointed by Christ. Authority, then, is not autonomous. It does not originate in the will, but is bound to something else, be it nature, knowledge, or the one in whose name it is exercised. If authority disregards this origin, it becomes illegitimate. The police officer, for example, has authority as long as he is acting in accord with the Constitution. The bishops and the clergy have to promise at ordination to faithfully serve the gospel of Christ and thereby the people of God. If they do so, they exercise their authority lawfully. If they do not, but act to some other end or will, they abuse the authority given to them. Since authority is generally paired with some power to act on that authority, when authority oversteps its bounds, we also find abuse of power. This abuse of power can be sinister and self-serving, but it does not have to be Machiavellian. It does not have to seek power for its own sake. It can consist not only in a failure to act for the right end, but also in the failure to choose the right means. I'm sorry if a lot of this sounds very abstract, but maybe the following example will help. Parents, as we have said, have a natural authority over their children. They also have the power to enforce their commands. And all is good when they do so for the flourishing of the child and choose appropriate, that is, good, means to achieve that end. But sometimes, while still having the good of the child in mind, they may choose bad means to achieve the desired result. They may, for example, persuade a child to do something through false promises, which they never intend to keep. That is understandable after a long day of work when dealing with a 2-year-old who won't stop asking why. But it is not good parenting. No judgment, we are all flawed. But I think you get the point. The natural authority over a child does not extend to using lies in complying behavior. Those lies will in fact erode our authority. Similar ways of abusing authority and power can be found in other cases. Experts can abuse their authority and power by invoking their supposedly higher qualifications to stifle a discussion that would challenge their thesis. They don't have to do so because they are power-hungry. They may do so because they are sincerely convinced that the alternative theory has some serious negative consequences. Just a few short years ago, that seemed to be a major issue in the media and the medical profession. Or take churchmen. Churchmen abuse their authority and power whenever they are not making the gospel, but their own ideas, the spirit of the times, fear, receiving praise, pleasure, or some selfish reason, the guiding principle of their actions. Here, the fault lies clearly in the end they seek. But sometimes they may also choose a course of action because they think they see a faster or better way, a shortcut to reach the right end. What's so bad about briefly violating the foundation of your authority if the outcome seems right? I think church history is full of this. The number of evil men is far outnumbered by mediocre, fearful, unwise, impatient men. Men who put their own reasoning on how to achieve some good over the way of the cross taught by Christ. People who choose the wrong means to pursue what may be the right end. That is not an excuse. I'm just saying that you don't have to look for evil intent to find evil deeds. I would not even be surprised if much of the cover-up of abuse, a veritable evil, was not undertaken because all those churchmen had sinister plans or delighted in evil, but because they were afraid that the scandal would lessen the credibility and effectiveness of the church, which in their mind was and is a force for good in the world. Well, that obviously not only horribly failed the victims and survivors, but failed catastrophically even in its object. In fact, decisive, immediate action would have prevented not only much harm and suffering, but also served that intention better. That is the shameful lesson to be taken, and one that some people in high places still don't seem to get. So power and authority are two components in organizational structures. To prevent them from going bad, you need a check on them, something that will let you judge if they are exercised legitimately and they have a claim on you, or if they've run amok. In modern states, this is often done by a constitution together with a constitutional court that safeguards its faithful interpretation when questions arise. This sets the parameters of action for all those who exercise power and authority. Corruption and abuse will still occur, but there is also a check on them. The Church, if you will, also has a constitution. For the Christian, it consists in the teaching and example of Christ. And these are attested in Scripture, but not alone. As we have mentioned last episode, Scripture needs to be read in a living tradition, a tradition that is in fact older and more comprehensive than the written word. The author of the Gospel of John himself states that he did not record all things. But who can doubt that all those things that he witnessed did also form his message and his ministry. What then is tradition? It is not just any human custom or opinion with some antiquity that exists in the Church. No, it is quod semper, quod ubique, quod ab omnibus creditur. What is always, what is everywhere, what is believed by all, as the monk Vincent of Lerins defined it in the 5th century. In this way, tradition serves to faithfully transmit the message of Christ. And in this way, it checks the creativity and arrogance of those who happen to be alive at any one time. Like any constitution and its high court, it puts a check on the will of those who hold power. It shows the limits of their authority. Any priest, bishop, or even pope who departs from that which we have received has overstepped his authority. For they are never masters over the faith, but its servants. This is where people often misunderstand the power of the Pope. They have a crude and exaggerated view of his authority, as if he ruled over the faith. He does not. And that is why, when I look at the Vatican of our own day, I might be saddened, angry, and upset, but not shaken in my Catholic faith. I hold that the office of the Pope is important, in fact, infallible under certain very limited circumstances that are necessary for the unity of the Church, which his office is to serve. But as all Catholics, I know from history that the Pope can be a bad man, an evil man even, someone who confuses rather than helps, someone who is silent when he should speak, a bad shepherd appointing bad shepherds. I don't rejoice in it, but I accept it as much as I accept that one of the 12 betrayed Jesus, and I have to accept that I myself betrayed Jesus through my faults. I don't believe in the holiness of all members of the Church, but I firmly believe in the holiness of God. The upshot of all of this for a Catholic is: don't be Catholic because your team here on earth is so great. It is not. If you think it is, just look closer. But that should not discourage you. Being Catholic should not be a tribal affair anyway. Be Catholic because you're convinced that the Church's teaching is true. Be Catholic because you are convinced the Church preserves the teaching of Christ through the help of tradition, which the office of St. Peter has to serve even when its occupants are rarely saints. Never put people on pedestals. No religious founders, no charismatic speakers, no princes of the Church. Respect the office, which is limited and exists to serve you. But know that he who holds the office is not only fallible, but that he will fail. So do not confuse the sanctity of the office with the person holding it, to reiterate Lord Acton. When a priest, bishop, or pope serves you well, it is not so important to thank them. For if they do it well only by the grace of God. So thank God instead, and pray that those good men don't fall from grace. If, on the other hand, they do something bad, then attribute it to them, as is just, and not to Christ's mystical body. For any bad fruit does not come from God, but from us. So don't lose heart, but pray for their conversion. And if any of them do you harm, physically or spiritually, by abusing their authority and power, then, as difficult as it may be, please break the silence and hold them accountable. If not for yourself and for your own good, then for the good of others, the good of the Church, and even the good of the perpetrators, lest they heap millstone upon millstone on their heads. I know this reflection was a long one, and had I included everything I'd written in my notes, it would have been twice as long and still insufficient. But for all its imperfections and things that can be rightly criticized, I hope there's also something that you can take away from this reflection and from this series as a whole. With this, I will fall silent again for a while, Maybe I'll be back in a year or so. I still have some ideas, but we'll see. To you, wherever you stand on the issues discussed in this series, I wish you God's love and blessings.